I'm Peter Underwood. This is News from the Water. Hunt the Porkies as CRT finally publishes its annual report. The publication of any organisation's annual report is an opportunity for the directors and corporate public relations executives to get together to present the best possible version of a business or organisation. Even if doing so means they have to lose a few numbers deep in the detail and emphasise the positive wherever it can be found. So it's common corporate practice and normally targeted at a limited audience, a handful of financial journalists and investment bankers. But Canal and River Trust, in its role as a sort of charity with wide commercial interests, has utilised its annual report from the very beginning as a way of impressing its funders in Whitehall and Westminster, as well as potential donors and external supporters and influencers. And voters as well, of course, but perhaps a long way down the list. Now, as a result, we've seen every year some figures move from one category to another, items included in one year's report and ignored in other years, or the basis for them changed, and it all makes any realistic comparison very difficult year on year. But fortunately, there are those, like my colleague Alan Richards, with the patience to examine every paragraph. And the contacts, of course, within CRT itself to be tipped off about the more blatant shenanigans. He, of course, exposed the falsification of the previous annual report, something CRT bosses did eventually admit, and the release of the 2020-21 report after a long delay meant that he and others have been looking at it with some scepticism. There have already been those asking whether the report has a version number to allow for later revisions, you understand, and others claiming to spot fiddled figures already. Now, Alan tells News from the Water that the annual report just released is not as important to CRT as the falsified one from last year, as the ongoing review of CRT's grant agreement with DEFRA ended its evidence collection and analysis in September, so they've used that previous adjusted report. Now, Alan says that with the 2020-21 year being affected by COVID, it can't be considered typical. Expenditure on charitable activities was in fact down by over £10 million, when typically this should rise. And having been told to expect income to drop by 15% and then later by 10% by CRT, the annual report shows no drop at all. However, most voters will be less impressed by headline figures than by CRT's spend on maintaining its waterways, or lack of it. He also says that much of this spend is hidden from us, as annual reports move expenditure between categories and mixes maintenance and non-maintenance within some areas. One exception is major infrastructure works, and so he's been comparing 2021, this year's report, last year's report, and the year of 2013-14, which was CRT's first full year of operation. In that first year, the spend was nearly 18.5 million. Last year, according to the report, it was nearly 50 million, and this year apparently 52.5 million. Alan says that suggests that the 12 and nearly 13 million increase in the government grant from 39 to 52 million, together with increased incomes from CRT's investment assets, has allowed CRT to spend on major infrastructure works, for them that spend to rise almost threefold. Unfortunately, he explained, this really isn't the case. The spend of 52.5 million is totally misleading, as it includes a provision for 36.3 million to be spent in future years. And that 36.3 million will be spent on 15 million for future Toddbrook reservoir costs, nearly 20 million for mandatory repair costs at other reservoirs which CRT owns and is obliged to keep up to scratch under the Reservoirs Act of 1975, and just over £1 million for future repair costs to that breach which closed the Arum colder for much of this year. In addition, that's in addition to the 1.7 million they spent there this year, of course. So that means that the real comparison is 18.4 million in the first year of its existence, with no provision for future years, and then 27.8 million spent in 2019-20, but 21 of that budgeted for future years. So just 16 million will be spent in 2021, with 36 million held back for future years. So Canal and River Trust actually spent £2 million less in 2020-21 on major infrastructure than it did in its first year of operation. Now, it's fair to say that wasn't the picture the Trust aimed to give in its annual report, but instead of increasing major infrastructure work spend by a factor of 3, which is what it tried to imply, CRT actually spent less than in its first full year of operation. Now, whilst CRT's trustees want to give the impression that spend has gone up slightly from last year, despite COVID, the fact is that it's gone down, £11.6 million down. And Alan is now asking what the trustees are doing when they allow such misinformation into the public realm. Although, of course, he doesn't have high expectations, shall we say, of the trustees after they allowed CRT's chair, deputy chair and chief executive to falsify an annual report that they'd had previously approved. Boaters pay more for less. After a summer in which many boaters have found it impossible to freely travel the system, with major structural failures on big canals, long-term water shortages due to lack of maintenance, and of course numerous lock failures and other structures breaking. Canal and River Trust, after all of that, has now announced that it's hiking licence fees by 4% for narrowboats and by a massive 9% for wide beams, starting in April next year. CRT now claims that income from private boat licences accounted for around just 10% of its annual income last year, a figure which has been reduced year by year in financial reports since the Trust took over, mostly by isolating it from other income from boaters, especially mooring fees. Of course, those mooring fees accounted for a larger amount before CRT sold off British Waterways Marinas Limited. But even then, CRT consistently fails to set out how much income comes directly or indirectly from boaters. especially in relation to moorings where every moored boat on the system, virtually every moored boat on the system, contributes with a share of the mooring fees going from the mooring operator directly into CRT's pockets. The Trust claims to keep licence price increases broadly in line with inflation forecasts, which it says is to shield boaters from a more substantial contribution to the full costs of looking after the network, in a delightfully passive-aggressive statement. Boaters are also waiting to hear how much the Environment Agency will hike fees after a massively negative reaction to its consultation on fees earlier this year, with many claiming they get even less value from the Environment Agency waters than from CRT. And gold licence holders will also get the bad news once the EA has made a decision, but the value of their licence will be somewhat less this year or next year, as from April the gold licence holders who wish to travel through the middle levels, essential to get from the Nene through to the other Environment Agency waters in East Anglia, will need an additional Anglian pass from the Environment Agency. Because the reason those wide beams will be paying a lot more to CRT is that after a somewhat chaotic consultation, the Trust decided to introduce extra pricing bands for boats over 7 foot wide, which will now pay another 5% on top of the 4% hike. Now, CRT claims this will ensure that the financial contribution made by boaters toward the cost of looking after the waterways is spread fairly across the boating community. Isn't that nice? You cannot be serious. The National Association of Boat Owners and Hussar has long been concerned about Canal and River Trust's continuing sales of heritage properties. And she was instrumental in getting them to provide a list of recent sales after a long struggle. But now the apparent complacency of the Inland Waterways Association on the issue has led to a Facebook exchange this week in which she describes herself as without words. The IWA had just told her that they had brought the subject up with CRT, who claimed to carry out heritage impact assessments on properties that cost more to maintain than they generate in income, and to use that to decide whether or not to sell. The IWA are apparently now satisfied after that discussion that as long as CRT follows its own procedures, the IWA wasn't concerned about the loss of waterways heritage. Anne's horror at this casual acceptance of heritage sales was then challenged by IWA campaigns officer Amy Alice Tilson, who said,
"As IWA campaigns officer, I'm working very hard to make sure waterways heritage is protected. It would be good to understand what it is exactly from my reply to a previous question that doesn't sit right with you. Protecting heritage is a core campaign for us. IWA does not feel that a blanket policy of campaigning for navigation authorities to retain their listed properties is useful. It's far more complex than that. We do, however, want to see a full heritage impact assessment carried out before a decision to sell is made, and appropriate governance in place if they are sold. I feel that as organizations we have the same objective in mind, of protecting waterways heritage, and we are keen to work together on this.
So Anne asked,
Amy Alice, do you mean NABO and IWA working together, or IWA and CRT? Covenants can, and are, ridden over roughshod by developers. It is no protection for our unique heritage. Over the years, BW and CRT have sold off many iconic buildings. Soon there will be nothing of value, both monetarily and historically, left to sell. Has the IWA only this year realised this is happening?
Amy Alice Tilson's reply came,
IWA has been working to protect waterways heritage for decades, and has successfully campaigned to protect many waterways buildings over the years. We are well aware that listing and covenants are not fail-safe protection, but neither is being in the ownership of a navigation authority, unfortunately. It's up to us all to work together, monitor planning applications and improve awareness and understanding of the importance of waterways heritage. We will keep talking to anyone and everyone to try and protect our heritage, and we would love to work with NABO on this. Email so we can discuss further.
For her part, Anne said,
Thank you. NABO has a council meeting soon. I'll add it to the agenda.
However, other NABO members had been digging, and Mark Tizard shared a listing from a London estate agents for one of the houses being sold. He said,
Something fishy here, regarding the claim that the two London properties cost more to maintain than they generate in revenue. I have just checked the Junction House and it rents for £35,000 a year, or £700 per week. Does it cost more than that to maintain it?
A very good question, and it prompted Anne to go back to Amy Alice saying,
It does look rather like the reason it costs more to maintain than the revenue received rather strangely doesn't apply here. I wonder how many more could be revealed by some digging.
Another long-term NABO activist, Alan Richards, also did some digging and found another heritage property up for sale with the claim that it costs more to maintain than it brought in. It was in fact bringing in around £30,000 a year, let us 3 rooms with a shared bathroom, kitchen and lounge, a return that will be much higher than the cost of maintaining the building. Once again, blowing a hole in the IWA acceptance of CRT's claim. Another ombudsman cop-out. A case of Graham King, which we've covered a couple of times on News from the Water, a new boater who travelled 500 kilometres over a 3-month period, only to be told by Canal and River Trust that immediately after a national lockdown he was not travelling far enough, and that his 3 months journey didn't count because he was a new boater. Now, the Waterways Ombudsman, Sarah Daniels, has supported his complaint that CRT took too long to reply to his initial formal complaint, and told them to apologise for that and for giving Graham the impression that there were special rules for new boaters. That's when they told him his initial 500-kilometre journey didn't count because he was a new boater. But Graham, in turn, has lodged a complaint with the independent chair of the Ombudsman Service that Sarah Daniels has also exceeded the allowed time in responding to his complaint. Unfortunately, Sarah Daniels' report, whilst it acknowledges those minor flaws, doesn't accept Graham's full case. She does acknowledge that during the course of her investigation, the information on the Trust website, which claims to provide further explanation and examples of how a boater can demonstrate compliance, had changed, and a reference to the range of 20 miles or more had been removed. But Jin goes on to defend CRT, saying,
Presumably this is because the example was being used as justification by boaters that, having travelled a distance of 20 miles, they were compliant with the rules, which was not the intention. Mr. King believes he has acted in line with the written terms and conditions, Boater's Guide and FAQs, and has been compliant throughout. However, as explained in this report, he has not demonstrated to the satisfaction of the Trust that he has been engaged in bona fide navigation throughout the network, throughout the year. Although he describes the licensing department as hostile, they have simply been advising him, in good time, of the need to continuously cruise if he wants to retain that particular boat license.
Now, I'm not sure where it says in any CRT document throughout the network throughout the year, but in effect she said CRT can change their terms and conditions as they choose, and all she can do is to decide whether they're obeying their own rules. It seems she's unable to tell them when they go beyond the laws which actually govern them. River Lee battle rumbles on. The battle over Canal and River Trust's decision to renege on its promise to put a hold on so-called safety zones and their restrictions on mooring on parts of London's River Lee is now turning into a war of attrition. Boaters are already starting to ignore the new no mooring signs as part of a widespread protest of civil disobedience, and the National Bargee Travellers Association is now seeking volunteers to tramp the towpaths of the River Lee in the disputed areas, putting up posters and speaking directly to boaters to urge them to join their name to the pledge to flout the new signage, which NBTA says will result in 295 lost mooring spaces in London. They never seem to think of the consequences. That's it from me. Thanks for watching.
We need video and photos of all aspects of the waterways. Email files to peterunderwood2@gmail.com with your name and a brief description of it and where and when it was shot.